Wars, Defensive and Aggressive, 1916. Preamble. This is a part of Zinoviev's larger work called The War and the Crisis of Socialism, which I have access to online, but it is in Russian and I couldn't be fucked for reasons that you'll most likely see in the future. If you want me to actually read this and try to retell, you need to pay me. But without further ado, man, those capitalists sure do love to defend themselves, aren't they? Quite convenient, dare I say, almost as if you can fool the masses into believing any old shit so long as you can claim you're defending yourself. In fact, this claim is so convenient, everyone uses it. Everybody is defending themselves. Not sure against what, though. Back in the day, the just war of defense and all that other defending the fatherland stuff meant you were defending the nation against a foreign oppressor. Nowadays, however, what this means is the defense of the capital. And that capital seeks to defend itself from becoming obsolete by the obviously better and superior system, socialism. But we're probably getting ahead of ourselves, dear listener. What even is a war of defense and a war of aggression? After all, it should be really easy to discern if you're one or the other. Well, you see, no. It's actually more complicated than you think. See, wars can be waged in a historical sense and diplomatic sense, and both are very important. One would think that if one side attacked the other, that means the attacker is the aggressor one, but oh my sweet summer child, no! This is merely the diplomatic and strategic side of the conflict. The other important one is the historical development, the ultimate conclusion that a war has on the history and the development of the world. What we need to understand when viewing wars from a historical lens is which one of the sides ultimately fought for progress. That's also not as easy of a question as you may think. In comparison to feudalism, capitalism, or to be more specific, national capitalist states, are progress. So when a capitalist state defends itself from a feudal one, that's good. Similarly, in comparison to capitalism, socialism is progress. Thus, logically, when a socialist state is being defended against the capitalist one, that's good. Understanding a war in a historical sense is much more important than understanding it in a diplomatic sense, because the whole context of the war can be viewed differently depending on what sense do we use. Sure, revolutionary France just attacked their neighbors indiscriminately, but in a historical sense, that is good, because national capitalist countries were attacking imperialist ones. Then Zinoviev shows us some examples of complicated wars, like Italian War of 1859. Diplomatically, Italy was the aggressor, but historically, they were defending their nationalist Italian Union. German-French War of 1870-1871. Diplomatically speaking, both France and Germany were guilty of this war. The question is not who was the aggressor, but rather who was more aggressive. But historically, Germany was defending its right to unify and to eliminate feudal atomization of German lands. France was the aggressor because it was hell-bent on making sure that Germany will never unify, and that is bad because national capitalism is always better than feudal imperialism. Now let's talk about the War of 1877-1878. From the perspective of some Bulgarian peasant, it was a truly defensive war for their emancipation against the Turks. Meanwhile, the global powers immediately started to broker and take parts of Turkey for themselves. And this is what we mean when we state that modern wars have lost all meaning when it comes to discerning if the war is aggressive, defensive, or even democratic. Nowadays, wars are not conducted for democracy or freedom. Wars are now conducted to take as many resources and wealth from their enemies and allies as possible, which they then call just and defensive to save face. And that's only the Europeans that the imperialists have at least some vague sort of camaraderie towards. For non-Europeans, they don't even have that. Any and all actions imperialists take outside of Europe, be it Germans against Herreros or English against Boers, are nothing but slaveholders dividing slaves and capturing more slaves. But note here, Boers declared war against Britain first. Diplomatically, they're the aggressor, but historically, they are the defended. Ethiopia was the aggressor diplomatically, but defender historically. China was raped by the imperial powers, and there are many other examples one can put, Cuba, Morocco, etc., but the point of it all is simple. Currently speaking, no war is ever truly just. It is always fought by one slaveholder against another slaveholder while other people suffer, and their motive is always the same: capital. They even say so themselves quite openly. To defend their trade and capital, they will use any pretext needed. We are always attacked, they are always attackers. And it works for any country you can think of. But we have rambled on, and Jesus Christ does this dude like to ramble. Let's have some ending remarks. One of the ways to discern who is the attacker is also to see if they're prepared for war. Generally speaking, the side that is better prepared militarily for the war is more often than not the aggressor. But none of this really matters much, because what the working class wants is not a war, but a just war. Those ones are impossible these days. Well, I say impossible, but there are only two cases when the war is truly just. When a communist state defends itself against a capitalist regime, and when the oppressed nations are fighting against their imperialist oppressors. Anything else can never be just. And true socialists must remember that. To characterize an imperialist war as just is possible only for an agent of the bourgeoisie. Defensive wars are no longer possible in our day and age. In fact, one can even say that for a true socialist, the mere definition of defensive war is meaningless. The only thing that matters are the interests of the social revolution. Mayhaps the mere idea of a fatherland itself is nothing but a farce as well.